I'm Gülgün Kayim. I'm the Director of Arts, Culture and the Creative Economy for the City of Minneapolis. And I am very new to government. I arrived 6 years ago and pretty much had the privilege to pretty much craft what I do in the city. And I'm going to, if you bear with me, there is a method to this madness. I am talking about similar things to what the other speakers are talking about, but I'm taking a different lens. Whoops. Oh, back. Thank you. I'm talking about arts and culture, and I'm going to be talking about artists in residence in particular within city government. So before I continue and describe a little bit about what Minneapolis has been up to, I want to talk about what we think of when we think about arts. Often, we think about arts and investment in arts as part of our capital infrastructure. We think about buildings such as this. We think about public spaces and sculptures such as this one, filling those public spaces. And often these things represent aspirations, civic aspirations, or statements of identity or conquest. That's what the arts have often been thought about as products to edify us, to make us feel good about ourselves, products to mark our spaces, and often the winners get to mark those spaces. But when we began to think about artists in residence within the city of Minneapolis, we asked ourselves, what about artistic processes? What do they have to offer government? Before I continue, I want to stop here for a moment, because this is someone who has inspired me for many years, and go back to the beginning of the morning to France. So Michel de Soto wrote The Practice of Everyday Life. It was a sort of a challenge to urbanists all over the world. And one of the things that de Soto said in his book, and I have quite a few of his quotes here, so you've got to bear with me, is the city is the stage for a war of narratives. And we've just been listening to why it's a stage for those wars. It's a place where complexity meets, where everyday life encounters each other, where the haves and have-nots come together. And how those narratives are manifested is often really the tensions that we feel in the environment. And de Soto felt that as we live our lives, the practice of everyday life, the encounters that we have, are actually also narratives. They're how we make sense of ourselves and our lives in public spaces. So he called the term narrativizing. It's hard to say. He's French. What am I going to do? So he said that living is narrativizing. Stirring up or restoring this narrativizing is thus also among the tasks of any renovation. One must awaken the stories that sleep in the streets that lie within a simple name folded up. And for someone like me, someone who isn't actually, I don't have a background in public anything. I actually come from the arts. I'm a background in performance. I have a Master of Fine Arts. That's not a piece of poetry. That's an instruction manual. So by that, what I mean by that is actually that the creative city making program, which the city has been embarked in for the last 3 years, has been experimenting with an alternative way to engage with art and artists, working within making cities more equitable, making cities more understandable, engageable, making cities more human. Through this new program, we are intentionally cultivating artistic processes to create intersections where city staff and artists can address issues of disparity among people who live and work in Minneapolis. These intersections between diverse fields, sectors, or cultures and perspectives we see as the birthplace of new thinking, which is the source of new behavior. The new behavior we are seeking is to allow diverse voices to be heard, residents to influence decision-making, and government to be more responsive in creating a city that works for all without exception. Intersectionality. So this work is really about that. The creative city-making model is based on these intersections at many levels. It's at the heart of this work. It's in the spirit of this work. And before I go on to talk about how that's manifested, I'm going to pause for a moment and talk a bit about my intersectionality. So what brings me here? I've already mentioned that I have a background in performance. I also happen to be from the Middle East. I'm Turkish. I come from a Muslim family. I grew up in a, oops, hello, what's happening? Thank you. The island I'm from is called Cyprus, and if anyone knows about the history of the Middle East, you also know it was colonized. And the reason I have an English accent is because my family had to flee war and violence on the island of Cyprus. In fact, this is a view from my home village in a divided island. And this is actually, my mother says she was born here, and that's our view out of our window on the south side of the island in this divided community. So I come from a perspective of traumatized communities as a result of colonization. And I come to this work having experienced immigration, displacement, and trauma, all within this other context, not within the United States. Well, although I do have to say I'm also a new immigrant. I became an American citizen in September of last year. Thank you. I'm going to be voting. Anyway, so intersections. We all know that this is about intersections. Spaces of the city are intersections where we meet. People experience this environment fluidly. They do not experience it as silos. We go from transportation to our homes. We go from our homes to our jobs. We encounter each other in the city streets and spaces. These are all things that are fluid to us. And so we ask the question within our program, why can't this be fluid within government also? So in terms of who's working with us in these intersections, this model is based on city departments. So my program, which is brand new, it's based on community. It's based on project teams that work together. It also works with an organization called Intermedia Arts. Intermedia Arts is a community arts organization. It's a multicultural, multidisciplinary art center that for decades has been leveraging the power of arts and culture to transform communities. For the last 10 years, it also happens to offer cross-sector training to artists and non-artists. In fact, some of its greatest collaborators are activists. Our program is also built on a goal within the city of Minneapolis. It's known as One Minneapolis. So when I was talking earlier with some of my colleagues, I was saying we need some hooks of policy to start to build some of these ideas on. And one I've already mentioned is a directive to create an artist in residence program. The other important one is this one. This is a goal that every single department within the city has to address, how to eliminate disparities so that everyone can prosper, exactly as our previous speaker was talking about. We also have a perspective that helps in addition to creating this work. This is a city council's definition of racial equity. So we crafted this program to address these issues, not only because of new leadership within the city, but also because Minneapolis, which is known as a prosperous liberal community, also happens to suffer from some of the worst racial disparities in the nation in every significant marker of well-being: housing, health, jobs, education, and identity. And yes, we are part of the GARE cohort. So, testing the idea. As I mentioned, we started in 2013. When we started, we did not have a Bloomberg Innovation Grant within the city of Minneapolis. We also did not have any staff member in equity and inclusion. We pretty much started this because we felt that artists could work across silos, could work to partner with city staff, to engage with city staff on the issues that they found the most pressing. And what were those issues? Well, you've already been naming them. Community engagement. That was the first department we went into. We went into the Department of Planning. So in 2013, we received funding from ArtPlace to work with the Department of Planning. 7 artists teamed with community long-range planning to work on lots of different planning projects. It was actually their 1 year of work. We took over their work plan. These types of plans were small area plans, transportation plans, a capstone study, and a cultural plan. What were these results? Oops, I have to back up a little bit, sorry. We're missing one team. Oh well, sorry, there was one additional team I needed to show, but it's not in here. So the results, in those first 2 years, we really were throwing spaghetti on the wall. We wanted to know, when we approached planners, what is your greatest challenge? And they told us exactly what you've been hearing: connecting with communities, participatory decision making. It's very difficult for us to have that meeting and have the same folks walk in the room. Those meetings are no longer working for us. So we said, well, let's figure out what artists can do. You continue to do your own process, but let's figure out a way that artists may help you. And artists did. They created prototypes that were simple and playful. We learned that even though we are very sophisticated technologically, this wasn't working for every community. So artists used low-tech methods that were simple and playful. These were structured specifically to engage underrepresented communities. And these meant different things for different parts of the different plans and for different communities. It meant different things for youth. It meant different things for communities of color. It was important that we expanded who we could access and connect in any planning process. And we did this with an understanding that one size did not fit all. And artists developed these. Mobile-friendly approaches was one way to develop. They created approaches in different parts of the city that were attending to people where they were. We broke open the mold of a meeting. We declared no meetings. No meetings anymore. We were going to go out and engage people in the spaces where they were. We were going to ask them questions about what it was like to live where they lived. We were going to engage with them in moments of celebration and ask them questions in those moments too, because we wanted to have an asset-based conversation. We didn't want to talk from a disparity-based conversation. One thing that we've learned through this project is when you begin to talk from a place of fear, you end up with structures that represent that. You end up with buildings that put walls up. You end up with places that are not human scale. Instead, they're built to push people away. So we wanted to have asset-based conversations in places using arts and culture as that celebratory model, as an inclusive model that acknowledged everyone that was with us in that conversation. And as you can see, we turned surveys into these visual images. We biked to locations. We took frameworks. We took frameworks to have deeper conversations about the built environment with communities. In the process of 10 months, that's supposed to be a 10, not 1. In the process of 10 months, we created 22 new tools, 7 new strategies. Here's the zine we talked about. That's Sam, who's an architect and also an organizer. We created giveaways. We used art as an attractor. We engaged with youth. We found that youth would not come to city planning. That's, again, no surprise. This particular neighborhood was a neighborhood that was fast transitioning, high development, a lot of pressure on development because students, it was a growing part of our city. But yet students were not part of the conversation. They were using this neighborhood as thoroughly as residents, and yet residents were at the table pounding their fists, wanting the same issues with government. We changed the conversation because we created 40% of the data for the plan through this one method. This particular method was for our historic capstone study. We used a very simple process to get people to stop, really stop and look at their environment. And through looking, have conversations with us about what they see. What are those stories about that built environment? What are your experiences there? What does joy mean? What does pain mean in that space? That's how we gathered much of our qualitative input for this particular plan. We also work with communities to have them set the questions for the plan. We partner a lot with Hennepin County, which is the county in which Minneapolis resides. And in this particular project, our partners were behind us. So we said, we're going to continue. And before you get started on the planning process, we're going into communities where they work and ask them, what questions would you want to be asked during this process? And we brought that back. And it actually impacted this particular transit project. And now the Hennepin County has created something called Play on Penn, because they learned that this community is missing green space. We also dealt with real-time reality. Diane Willow here created a foot camera. Why? Because she was testing walk sheds within a station area. She handed people the tools to actually test the physical reality of walking from the station area to where they needed to go. And we gave that particular foot cam to anyone who wanted to use it so that they could navigate and track their experiences that went into the overall data for this particular project. The artists then created sculptures demonstrating the different topographies, the real topographies, not the technical conversations that we were having in a room, but the real topographies that people were experiencing at all states of ability, from working mothers to people with disabilities to children. You name it, we gave them the foot cam and they used it. Again, we created, in this particular one-year process, we engaged 1,800 individuals, 58 arts-based engagement. 90% of the people we engaged with had never experienced any kind of planning process. And in the cultural plan itself, this was the second year of work, we took the opportunity to refine further on our project. We decided that we were not only going to engage with artists, we had 2 teams of artists in this case. This was a project that I managed, but we were going to engage communities in analyzing the data. We created data jams. We worked with other organizations like Voices for Racial Justice in our community to help us understand how our own perspectives can actually be an asset in looking at this information, because how you digest that information will bring you the answers that you either expect or don't expect. So we asked communities, please help us analyze this data, and we created civic events to do that. We also understood through our own evaluation of our work that the artists were making the difference. Who they were. These were artists from the communities we wished to engage. It was them who drove. It's not just, so I want to emphasize this, a tool on its own is not going to work magic. An artist from the community you wish to engage with will, with that tool, make the difference. And these were the differences we made. For our cultural plan, we became more strategic. We created online surveys, we created open houses, and we waited to see who would respond. And then we deployed artists to those areas of the city that were not responding, and those communities and demographics who were not responding. And again, they were no surprise to us when we learned who they were. So artists tailored to specific communities, not to everybody. And through this process, we learned the differences that government makes and artists make. As you can see, the green is government. We know who we're successful with, and we know who we're not successful with. In this case, this was with age. We were not successful at reaching people under 34. Again, this one is with race. So again, the artist brought significant results to our project that made a difference in the actual work itself. The so what here, so what? This project continues. We have seen new pathways of engagement. Our community planning staff is now building artists into the comprehensive planning process. They're working in these engagement strategies. I have had 5 new departments come on board. We're working outside of long-range planning in lots of different departments. We have seen that staff has begun to think about engagement differently, from elected officials all the way down to staff, but it's incremental work. I want to point this out. It is slow work. But these are some of the differences we saw in the first couple of years. And we've refined the concept to really fully engage in these difficult conversations. As we've already heard through our presenters, this is not easy work. A lot of folks think that they've got it cornered, these difficult conversations, and actually think it's their neighbor that has the conversations. Well, we put city staff in that process partnering with artists as their thinking partners. And we know that you've got to lean into the conflict. Because if you lean into the conflict, that's where innovation comes. By avoiding it, you're avoiding the point. And so we've created some simple rules to manage the complexity of what we're dealing with. We also, as I mentioned, have 5 new projects. And in these projects, these are the questions that we're beginning to ask. What if residents had equal access to computers, the internet, and technology? Basic questions. This is the team that's working on that. What about tenants? 50% of our city are tenants. What if they had a voice in the process to inform policy? This is a project that Mankway Ndossi and Reggie Prim are developing with inspectors using theatre of the oppressed methods. Blueprint for racial engagement. This is our neighborhood and community relations department working with filmmakers to go out into communities and ask them, what does racial equity mean to you? I want to point out that a lot of the projects we choose are systemic. We're really interested in transformational work. We're not interested in transactional work. This isn't where I'm partnering with a department to deliver to them a graphic design. I'm really partnering with a department to have them think differently about the policy areas, about their behavior, about how they work, about how they think. And I'm thinking here about small p policy. When it comes, and that's, how you are, how you show up. Now, this project did get to the ordinance level, as did our cultural plan. So these 2 projects did achieve changing policy at the big P level. But that's great. That's a bonus for us. Long-range planning continues, as I mentioned, in their comprehensive plan. This time, they're mapping intangible assets. And they're mapping them in the Somali community in Cedar Riverside, working with artists. And what are these intangible assets? I'm actually back where I started. These intangible assets are people's daily lives, are their relationships, are their feelings. Sometimes it's their encounters with each other. These intangible assets are intangible because they're not in the infrastructure yet. And finally, electoral engagement. What if we could reach communities and we had culturally specific ways to engage these communities in the voting process? So these are some of our projects. 5 departments just wrapping up their projects. 3 of them will continue. 2 of them have chosen to stop. We have 5 new departments that we're now looking at. So we'll be working with 8 in the next year. And I'm going to end again with my favorite philosopher, Michel de Soto. And as he says, as I've been emphasizing here, it's the wordless histories of walking, dress, housing that shape our neighborhoods on behalf of absences. They trace out memories that no longer have a place, childhoods, traditions, timeless events. To the visible city, they add those invisible cities about which Calvino wrote. And I want to say, if we're going to engage in this story, in this conversation about making cities, then where are those stories? Whose stories do we tell, and how do we tell them in the physical environment? Thank you.